dear listeners, and welcome to Reformed Meditations. I'm Lee, and I'm here with a guest, Conley Owens. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name's Conley Owens. I'm a pastor at Silicon Valley Reformed Baptist Church. I'm the husband of one wife and the father of 7 kids, soon to be 8 kids. Yeah, and I live here in Sunnyvale, California.
Wonderful. Well, so glad to have you on the show, and we're discussing your book, The Dorean Principle, if I'm saying that right.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
It works for the American ear, I guess, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I usually say Dorian, but a lot of people say Dorean. Neither of those is exactly how you'd pronounce it if you were in a Greek class, but...
Yeah, bad marks either way for us. So tell the listeners kind of what's the big idea of your book? What are you trying to get across to the reader?
Yeah, so Dorean is the Greek adverb that means freely. Jesus said in Matthew 10:8, freely you received, freely give. And then right after that in Matthew 10:9 through 10, he says the worker's worthy of his food. So it's a book about how we should think about money and ministry, given that Jesus says in one verse, don't receive pay, and in the very next verse, do receive pay. So what kind of pay is not allowed and what kind of pay is allowed? And the distinction that Jesus is making is one between reciprocity, where the gospel is being exchanged for money, which he's forbidding, and then colabor, where others are coming alongside the minister in order to support the work of ministry. So as God is sending out laborers into the harvest, in that context of Matthew 10, he is the Lord of the harvest. So if you think about, well, the worker's worthy of his wages, who's the employer that's supposed to pay those wages? Well, in context, the employer's already been stated. It's the Lord. So to think of people receiving the gospel as being customers who have to pay the wages is to miss the metaphor that's already been made there.
So this idea of colabor versus reciprocity, you want to define a little bit what you mean by colabor? Because I remember in the book, there wasn't I think you even mentioned that there wasn't like a precise word for exactly what this means, but you were going to use colabor just to get the point across. What is
Right.
kind of the import of that word colabor to you?
Right, yeah, so in the book I use the word colabor without a hyphen, which the real word actually has a hyphen, so that's kind of my way of saying, when I say this, I kind of mean it my own special way. But the definition of colabor is basically support given to a minister out of an indirect sense of obligation, an obligation that's primarily to the Lord rather than primarily to the minister, whereas reciprocity would be one that's given out of a direct sense to the minister. And so a good analogy for this is the analogy that Paul gives in 1 Corinthians 9, where he talks about the priests, right? The priests are supposed to receive of the altar. They're supposed to be supported. This is where he's arguing for the kind of support the ministers are supposed to get, and yet at the same time explaining why he's not receiving the particular funds the Corinthians are giving him. And so if you think about how the Levites received from the altar, well, yes, the Israelites had a sort of obligation to the Levites, and they supplied them, but they were supplied ultimately from the Lord as the sacrifices that were made to the Lord, the offerings, the tithes that were made to the Lord were then given to the Levites. So it's an indirect obligation, right? The people are primarily obligated to the Lord, and then secondarily or indirectly obligated to the Levites. So they weren't giving to the Levites directly. They were giving indirectly to the Levites as they made their sacrifices and offerings. And by indirectly, I don't mean that, there was like a physical intermediary, or some people have taken me to say that, well, only the church should be collecting charity and then it should be doing all the charity work afterward with that money. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that conceptually, one who gives as colabor is giving out of shared service to the Lord rather than giving back to someone who did something for them as though that person were a free agent and the source of the gospel.
So how much of that work of colabor is an internal motivation, and how much of that is sort of an external responsibility or external response to a message? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, are you asking me? Are you asking me if this is a very subjective ethic where, I as a minister am bound by someone else's heart that I can't see, or
Right.
Yeah, so that is one thing that it kind of sounds like I'm saying, which I don't think I am. What I'm getting at is, as we collect funds as ministers or ministries, we have to do so in a way so that the words and gestures of fundraising communicate that we are not the source of the gospel and rather God is. And this is true with pretty much every other Christian ethic regarding communication, right? It's, do your words and gestures, are you doing due diligence so that they communicate the right thing as best they can? And so our words and gestures of ministry fundraising should be words and gestures that point to the Lord as the one who is the source of the gospel and the one that people are obligated to when they receive the gospel, not the minister directly.
Yeah, that makes sense, because you don't want to turn the gospel into a product that you're making a bid for or paying directly for, right? You don't want to be a merchant of the gospel.
Right, yeah, the gospel. When you pay for something, you're making a statement about how much something's worth, and so to put a price on the gospel is to value it far too low because it's of infinite worth. So yeah, that is one problem. It's not payment for the message, or even payment for the labor, since the laborer is working for another. Rather, it's service to the Lord so that He can fulfill His obligation to pay the laborer. And some people find it odd to talk about God being obligated, but He obligates Himself by way of covenant. He obligates Himself by way of promises. And as He has promised to care for His own servants, this is how He does it. This is one way that He has stated that He will do it.
I'm glad you mentioned covenant, because in my reading of the book, I saw that in the background of practically every chapter, right? The fact that we know that God has said and is bound by His word to deliver on the free offer of the gospel, and that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation for those who believe, that we can trust God will do that. We don't have to add to the gospel. We don't have to make it more attractive, but we also don't have to commodify it, or, like you said, act as if there is a temporal price for hearing the gospel. Because God is, like you said, covenant bound to deliver on the free offer of the gospel. Am I getting you right on that?
Right, yeah. And the promises I was talking about specifically are the promises that where there's the workers worthy of his wages, right? You have the statement that God will supply for His ministers. So, I'm primarily talking about his obligation to them rather than His obligation to the hearer who responds. But those are valid points as well.
Okay, good. So we've got both sides of that going there. Then, I found a quote from page 48 of your book, and I thought maybe I could get you to expound on it a little bit. It says, as a servant of God, Paul has stewardship over his converts to receive money from them, but would abuse that stewardship by receiving payment for a gospel that is not his to sell. That seemed, when I read that, to be a really nice encapsulation, at least of how I understood your book.
Right. So the question there is, as people read 1 Corinthians 9 and other passages, and they see Paul defending his right to receive money, for the right for someone who lives by the proclamation of the gospel to live by that gospel, being funded. A lot of people read that and say, okay, well, Paul's making this statement about how absolutely broad his permissions are, and then he's saying that because of circumstantial reasons, he's going to forgo that and kind of go above and beyond what's really required of him. And I think that misunderstands what Paul is talking about when he's talking about his rights, that he's not talking about some kind of absolute right that he has, this broad permission, but rather he's talking about a stewardship he has, a right of stewardship, and it is possible to misuse that stewardship. And 1 Corinthians 9, I don't go into this in detail in the book, although I did in the thesis that the book is based on. The way you read 1 Corinthians 9 is really related to the way you read 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, right? Because Paul is talking about in 8 and 10, meat sacrificed to idols. So he stops for a chapter to give an analogy. He said, he says, it's a lot like fundraising, and then he goes into this analogy. So if you think that what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, and this is probably the more common interpretation too, if you think that he's saying that, oh, well, it's okay as long as you're not offending anyone, you're going to come away from 1 Corinthians 9 saying the same thing too. Oh, you can take money whenever you want as long as you're not offending anyone. However, if you look at chapter 10, where he very directly calls it idolatry and very directly says you can't sit at the same table as demons, you realize he's giving something that's more absolute. Sure, he's giving contextual reasons in chapter 8, but in chapter 10, he's saying very directly that this is something that's not allowed so often as you are aware of what you are doing. If the other person knows it and you don't, you're not bound by his conscience. But if you're aware, then you're bound. And so if you understand it that way, then in chapter 9, once again, Paul's not talking about a bare permission, but talking about something that's a little more certain as far as his ethic. It's not that he's going above and beyond. It's that this is actually required of him that he not take, even though in a broader sense he does have stewardship over funds. Now, to make one more connection from there, in chapter 10, he says, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable, right? So that, like I said, 10 and 9 are very connected. So he's pretty much saying the same thing in 9, that he can do this, but it may not be profitable for him. Well, how do we understand these words lawful and profitable? If you look at chapter 6, he talks about actions being lawful but not profitable. And one of the examples he gives is talking about the body and sex and prostitution. So he describes prostitution as something that is lawful but not profitable. And if you see that and you realize that he's using the word lawful in a way very different from the idea of having this permissive license, but instead to talk about the lack of condemnation, or basically to play off of the Corinthian statements, the Corinthians kind of, I don't know what the right word would be, not antinomian, but something like that. They're the Corinthians have made these statements that are a bit off, and he's playing off their words. And when you realize he's doing that, when he's calling things lawful and not really saying that they would be okay, you realize that, he's not going above and beyond in chapter 9. When he refuses money, it's because he absolutely has to refuse the money.
I'm curious about perhaps how the Corinthian context may play into some of these decisions too, with
Sure.
the cult, for instance, like the cult prostitution that went on in the I believe in the temples around there, where I assume you'd be going in there giving money to get attention, to get time with the temple prostitutes. I wonder if Paul is especially zealous to draw a contrast between the ministry of Christ and the life that they had been formerly living in this sort of libertine fashion. Do you think how much of that plays a part on top of this principle?
Oh yeah, that may. If you're saying that Paul is addressing that kind of licentious behavior by saying that. Sure, now that you're in Christ, you can't be condemned on the basis of any of these things at the same time. That doesn't mean that you ought to go practice sin. It's kind of like what he says in Romans 6:1, right? Should I go on sinning so that grace may abound? May it never be.
Yeah, we're called to go on and live in a different way, one that honors God rather than gratifies our own sin. What are some ways... kind of moving into our day now and the intricacies of the evangelical world, what are some tangible ways that you think and would be willing to discuss that the church, or perhaps even the parachurch, are violating, if that's the right word, this principle? Maybe ways that are even subtle that we might not even consider. in your view?
Right. Yeah. So this is where it gets controversial. um, so yeah, I mean, if you think about that, okay, sure, ministry ought to be supported, by co-laborers, but it ought not to be given, the gospel, Christian instruction ought not to be given in exchange for anything. Well, that happens all the time, right? There are Christian conferences where you can't come unless you pay, and you're supporting the teaching, not just paying for the food. And then there's books and all kinds of things. And it's very clear now. It used to be the case that the paper and the teaching were kind of interwoven. And so it wasn't really clear what you're paying for. Now, now that there's Kindle books and it's really clear that you are just paying for the teaching and not the paper, it's very clear that you are purchasing religious instruction.
So, for instance, this would be outside the conference context, but let's say I'm at a ministry website where the ministry has a bookstore, right, on the website, and I'm paying them to buy certain books from that ministry, and then that clears, it shows up on my credit card, the full charge is on there, and the books get shipped to me. How does that square with the principle? Because there's no teaching involved, I'm simply buying resources and then giving on top to this ministry. Does that clear it? The fact that there's no actual teaching involved, and I haven't, for instance, bought a DVD series of a recorded teaching session.
Yeah, well, what kind of books are you buying? Theology books,
like theology books? Yeah.
Okay, sure. So yeah, there's a lot of different aspects of that. One is the idea of, and I'm going to change your hypothetical here. Let's say someone says, here you can, I'll give you this book for free, or maybe not for free. I'll give you this book for a suggested donation of $5. When money is involved in that transaction, once again, are you doing due diligence with those words and gestures of fundraising to not suggest that you are the source of the gospel, right? When you're charging money for that thing, or even saying suggested donation in return, reciprocally for that thing, you're imposing an obligation, even if it's not an absolute requirement. So, and then going beyond that, if it's not optional, right, if it's a requirement that you have to pay me for this teaching, right, because theology books are teaching, then yeah, that would still violate the principle. Now, someone might say, well, what about the paper? It costs money to print these things. I would say, well, yes, it does. And so, if you're charging for the paper, that is not as bad as charging for the teaching. However, the way I phrase it in the book is that gospel proclamation, this applies to gospel proclamation and everything that directly attends to gospel proclamation. Now, it's interesting because I recently was going back through some of the historical sources I was using, and I'd forgotten that Aquinas describes this very similarly. He says anything that is spiritual or annexed to spiritual things ought not to be charged for. So the book, the paper book, I would consider something, in Aquinas' words, that's annexed to the gospel. You've put it in a state where they're coming together, just like Jesus when he sent out the disciples in Matthew 10:8 and said, "Freely you receive, freely give." That was right after saying, "Heal the sick, raise the dead." It's not like it would have been okay for them to charge for the miracles and then offer the gospel for free. And similarly with Paul, you see him travel around. He refuses food and drink. He doesn't say, well, if you provide my room, if you provide my food, if you provide my ship ticket, then I will preach for you, right? He not only does not ask for those things, he won't even accept those things if they are offered. So I think that if we as ministries are going to be offering books and producing books, that we should be giving them away for free. Now, there's a lot of other options for a ministry that might find that too financially difficult. Although, honestly, I don't think it's nearly as financially difficult as most people think it is. But let's say it is too financially difficult. The way this used to work prior to the mid 18th century, is that the printer, the publisher, and the author were very, very distinct, right? The author's this religious person wants to write something and get the word out, and the publisher is a secular entity that's trying to make a profit, so they find works that they can print and sell. And so one's operating in a purely secular capacity while the other's operating in a purely religious capacity. Now, the way that's changed, well, it's changed in a bunch of ways, but one of them is that in the middle of the 18th century, you have people starting to use copyright. Copyright didn't exist until 1710, modern copyright law. So it's at that point that authors can start requiring royalties for their works. See, before that, authors weren't really getting paid, not directly for having done something, unless they, they could put a dedication at the beginning of the book, and maybe that lord or lady would offer them a lot of money afterward. But yeah, they weren't being paid for their work.
Like having
directly.
A patron for a painter, for instance.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and so a modern example of that is there's a lot of print-on-demand services where I can stick my book up on CreateSpace or Lulu or whatever, and then when someone purchases it, they are just paying for that printer who's the secular entity disinterested in the theology, who just prints it on demand, and so they wouldn't be paying me. I would not be involved in this transaction at all. So I think that's one way around this issue for those who would think that this is asking too much.
I'm going to make a sweeping generalization and correct me if I'm inaccurate. But it seems to me that it's much simpler to handle issues of ministry funding at the local church level rather than at the parachurch level. It seems there's a whole other realm of difficulties when it comes to the risk of selling the gospel at the parachurch level. Would I be wrong in making that statement? Am I naive?
Right. No, that's pretty much exactly what I say in chapter 12. Is that a lot of people imagine that the church is just full of these things when they start reading it. Well, I guess in a way it is, but what happens in a local church from week to week? There's no problems there. The people are giving, they're supporting their pastor who's working alongside of them. They're all fellow servants. The Bible has instructions on weekly giving, right? And so that's typically how ministry is being fundraised. But when you have a parachurch ministry that doesn't have that weekly fundraising going on, has to get creative. And once you get creative, like you said, it gets complicated, and you have a lot more opportunities to violate the Dorean Principle.
So let's play Utopia for a second. What is in your mind, down to kind of the last detail, what is your ideal scenario for funding ministry, both at the local church level, even up to the parachurch level? What
Sure.
in your mind, if you were to create a system like this from top to bottom, informed by the Dorean Principle, how would you do it? What's your vision?
Yeah, it'd be pretty much how a lot of things work today. The church raises money on a weekly basis, and it does more partnering with each other and with whatever groups are doing ministry. Now, ideally, those groups that are doing ministry would just be churches or the members of churches, and so the churches would have no problem supplying them. But yeah, if we were to keep some of the larger parachurch organizations existing, then they would be partnering more with churches. I think if the church is doing the fundraising, that does keep things simpler. I don't think that's necessary. I don't want anyone coming away from this saying that I'm saying that's absolutely necessary, because, I think something like Patreon or whatever that parachurch entity or a single individual, a podcaster, for example, might use, all those are fine ways of co-laboring too. You say on your Patreon, like, if you want to help me, if you want to support me as I get this gospel content out, you can do it this way. The only difficulty is when you start adding perks to your crowdfunding campaign, so that if people donate at certain levels, they get access to special things that others don't.
Mm-hmm. Or get shout outs on your show or that kind of a thing.
Right. Yeah. All kinds of kickbacks.
Yeah. I've noticed I've never subscribed to anyone's Patreon before, and I don't run one, but I've noticed when people kind of give their pitch for going that way, that there's all sorts of extra benefits. If you go to the top tier, which is high dollar, then we mention your name on every episode, or or every YouTube video, or whatever, and that does kind of seem like the secular version of kind of an exploitative track like that.
Right.
So, just sort of as a summary, what would be your encouragement to the listeners when it comes to curiosity regarding this principle? What are some practical ways for the average Christian to be mindful of this, and to as the average Christian, as somebody who's not delivering teaching that may or may not be sold by a parachurch ministry or anything like that, just your average layman, how can they be mindful of this principle?
Right. So, just thinking about it on as they give, that's a starter, right? And recognize that, when you give to a church, you're not paying them back for something they do to you. You're working together with your church, ideally. You're working together with your pastor to make sure the gospel is proclaimed from week to week. So just having a joy about giving, that's one really big application, although in other way it's very minor, because it's, there's not a real change that's being asked for other than a mental one. Another one would just be to be mindful what kind of resources you're supporting and buying. I don't think that this ethic restricts or restrains people from purchasing ministry. It's funny, as I've been reviewing some historical sources recently. Most of them say that very plainly, because they were dealing with simony and the laying on of hands primarily. They would speak about simony more broadly to talk about selling any spiritual thing, but primarily they were concerned about buying ordinations. And so they would say, like, oh, you can never do this. You can never purchase any spiritual thing. I don't think there's anything wrong with purchasing someone's teaching. I think that at that point you're not necessarily encouraging corruption, but we could be. And so we ought to think about, what kind of ministries we're donating to. Are they ones that are upholding this principle? Or are they ones that are skirting this principle? That's something to consider. And a very practical way you could help advance Christian understanding on this issue, or a Christian conscience on this issue, is to simply order one of the books off the site and share one with your pastor. Now, it sounds like I'm making a sales pitch there, but if you've picked up on what I'm saying, the book is free. You can get even the paperback free, and the publisher covers shipping. So it will be, if you're in the U.S. If you're outside the U.S., we don't have a way to ship to you just yet. We're working on that. But if you're in the U.S., we will ship you the book for free, and you can share it with your pastor. So that's a real big impact thing you can do. That's also pretty easy.
I am curious. This is kind of somewhat off the topic. Who is this publisher? First Love Publications?
Yeah, sure.
I've never heard of them before.
Yeah, it's a group of Reformed Baptist churches. They do a whole bunch of different things. They have missions. They have a university that they're starting up, and they have a publishing arm. And they've been operating this way for quite some time, since 2006. They've been distributing books freely, including the shipping, ever since 2006. So when I wrote this book, they were very happy to see that someone had articulated a lot of the convictions that they had, but it had never, really written down in such a fleshed out way. And it was a good match.
Wow, that's pretty providential. So you had essentially codified what they were already operating by.
Right, exactly.
And so I hope that they're doing well financially.
Sometimes things get tight, but they just pray harder, and God works things out. So it's incredible how merciful and kind He is.
He does have a way of doing that. Well, how about you tell the listeners where they can go to request a copy of the book if they're interested?
Yeah, so the DoreanPrinciple.org. Dorean is spelled Dorean. And if you're on Facebook, there's a group called Money and Ministry. go join that. And there's a lot of people there talking about the principle, trying to figure out what it means for certain applications and so on. So yeah, the DoreanPrinciple.org. And and if you want to order the paperback, there's a link there. There's also all kinds of digital formats. It's right there on the website, so you can Control F right through it if you want to. There's a PDF, an EPUB, a Kindle version, an audiobook. If you have a podcatcher, you can just search. For the Dorean Principle, and you'll be able to subscribe to it just like a podcast and listen to it on your commute. And then lastly, of course, the paperback.
Excellent. Well, is there anything else you'd like to tell the listeners before I ask you one more complete non sequitur of a question?
I don't think there is. No. I've been trying to do more. This third time I'm mentioning it, more study of a history of how people have thought about simony and money and ministry. And I'm trying to collect those thoughts on our Facebook page, but I don't have any very interesting one. Well, maybe I'll just share, one I came across recently.
Sure.
Is Jerome on Micah 3:11. He's got a lot of interesting thoughts. Basically arguing that, priests in the Old Testament never received money. There are a couple of times in the Old Testament where you see someone prepare money to give a priest, but never that they receive it as payment. So one of those times is when where Saul is preparing money to give to Samuel, and it never says that he takes it. And another one where I think it's Jeroboam's wife prepares some goods to give to Ahijah the prophet. And anyway, once again, these things are interpreted by Gill and by Jerome and by others as being indications of the one who's trying to purchase prophecy from the prophet as a sign of their poor moral character. And then one example you do have where someone successfully paying a prophet is Elisha. When he heals Naaman wants to pay him. He refuses. But then Gehazi, his servant, goes and accepts the payment. And then Naaman's leprosy is transferred to Gehazi. So, yeah, those are some
never thought
interesting
about
things.
that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty direct statement that...
Wow.
Healings and prophecy and even teaching in Micah 3:11 ought not be sold. Yeah, Micah 3:11 is a real interesting passage. It says, and maybe I'll just pull it up here so I can quote it for you.
Yeah, let's read it.
Micah 3:11 says, "Its heads give judgment for a bribe, its priests teach for a price, its prophets practice divination for money. Yet they lean on the Lord and say, 'Is not the Lord in the midst of us? No disaster shall come upon us.'" So this is really fascinating because it's talking about these three different groups charging for the holy work that they're supposed to do, thinking that the Lord is on their side when actually he's quite displeased with what they're doing. And the three groups are the heads giving judgment, which the heads, these would be judges or basically mini kings, right? What is the king? It's the one who sits over the land and gives judgment. So you have the princes or the king, the priests teaching for a bribe, and the prophets practicing divination for money. So you have prophet, priest, and king, right? These are the three offices of Christ. And each of them charging rather than offering freely, right? Christ offers his gospel freely. It says in Isaiah 55:1, come to the waters. It talks about purchasing wine and milk without money and without price. And so Jesus offers freely, and yet these people in Micah 3:11 who are representing him by those offices are charging for money, and it's very corrupt. And so we, as we are part of a royal priesthood, right, meaning we are in a way kings under Jesus and priests under him, and no doubt prophecy fits in there too. We are his prophets speaking his word to people in a in some context, right? Like obviously I don't believe in continuing prophecy in the inspired sense, but we sit under him, mimicking these offices in a way. And if we charge for that work, then we are doing precisely what these people were condemned for, and we are misrepresenting Christ who gives these things freely.
Oh, that's fantastic. Wow. Yeah, that's really cool. I'm gonna have to. Yeah, this is a lot of stuff I really want to go back and continue wrestling with and consider. Fascinating. Well, for a non sequitur question, I have to ask: do you like Switchfoot? Yes or no?
Yeah, I do like Switchfoot. I saw them once. In the back of a small barbecue place.
No joke.
Like they were doing a concert, not just saw them eating, but
not just eating barbecue. Like, yeah. Oh, hey, Switchfoot. When was that? How long ago?
Oh, that was 2006. Yeah, wow. That was a while ago.
The heyday.
Yeah,
that's fantastic. All right, well, it's really been a pleasure talking to you. This was great. Really enjoyed reading your book, and like I said, I want to continue wrestling with this topic. So, yeah, I'm kind of fascinated by what you've presented. So, thank you for coming on and speaking with me. And I'll have all those links in the show notes to make it easy for people to check out what you're doing, check out the book, and all to the glory of God.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much, Conley. Good to talk to you.
You too. Take care. God bless.